Welcome back to the State of Sustainability. I'm your host, Saif Hameed. This time, we're covering another content bite, and I'm going to give my hot takes on the rarely talked about topic of EPR schemes. What are EPR schemes? Where are they hiding? What are they trying to do? Who's behind them? We'll look at the problems, the advantages, the upsides, the opportunities. It's going to be a fun episode. I hope you'll enjoy it. I had a fun conversation with Michael Kobori, who I know is a regular listener, but for those who don't know Michael was previously the Chief Sustainability Officer at Starbucks. And in our chat, we were talking about what we think the next themes are within the broader sustainability space. You know, what's hot, what's trending, what's coming soon. Obviously, we talked about what's happening right now. And one of the things Michael said he thinks everyone is going to be thinking about and talking about and acting on is EPR schemes. And fortunately, I knew what EPR schemes were, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. They're basically extended producer responsibility schemes. But following that conversation, I start to then chat around my circle, people I know, people I work with. And I basically just went around asking people, so what do you think about EPR schemes? And more often than not, the answer I got was, what is an EPR scheme? And then that meant I had to try and explain what it was. And then the conversation sort of died from there. So I thought actually it might be fun, might be interesting, might be useful to run an episode on EPR schemes. And to make this a little more interesting, because EPR schemes are not fun. They can be fun, but they're usually not fun. And the places you go to find information on EPR schemes are not fun places. I wouldn't go there if I were you. But to make it a little more fun, what I thought we could do is we could actually just talk about what is an EPR scheme? Where did this come about? What is the problem EPR schemes are trying to solve? How do they go about it? But then what I'd really love to focus on is just what do I think? What are my hot takes? Like, what do I think is going to be interesting in this space? What would I keep an eye on? And so we're going to run with that. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I've enjoyed thinking about the problem and finding the limited availability of information in my circle about the problem, which is disappointing, but let's go with it. So extended producer responsibility schemes, as with much sustainability regulation, I think, come from a sense that business needs to own more of the problem and that there is an externality that is not owned by business. An externality meaning this is something not covered in the course of business operations, but it is a cost imposed on the world, on society, on the environment. The first EPR schemes, I think, came out of Sweden. They tend to be very European in origin, and the idea was that we want to try and impose some sort of a cost on corporations so that they can actually fund the cost of collection of the packaging waste primarily that they produce. Extended producer responsibility basically meaning we're going to extend the boundaries of what we consider the producer or the brand or the business responsible for beyond simply point of sale. You are no longer just responsible for selling the product to your consumer and making sure the consumer doesn't die from it. You are also responsible for making sure that the end of life of that product is managed in a way that is safe for society. And that's the extended producer responsibility logic. A number of things have happened since the early days in the early 90s where EPR schemes started to be tested and tried. So my exposure to EPR goes back to around 2014-15. I was involved in a report called Stemming the Tide of Ocean Plastic, where we looked at, it was a collaboration between McKinsey, Ocean Conservancy, and a bunch of corporations looking at how we managed to stop plastic waste entering the ocean primarily from Southeast Asian markets. Subsequently, that report was recanted by Ocean Conservancy. They've stripped it from the website. You cannot find it. They have apologized for it being published. There was a very angry letter written by Greenpeace and many other nonprofits. But that is a story for another day. We'll go there at another time. For now, suffice it to say that that's where I got introduced to EPR schemes because I was looking at different ways to keep plastic out of the ocean. And a bunch of the organizations that I was speaking with, like WWF and Procter & Gamble and various others, Closed Loop Partners, I think was one of them, started talking about EPR schemes. And at the time in 2014, 2015, bear in mind I was at McKinsey, so, Jesuits of capitalism, we thought EPR schemes are never going to be a real thing. This is the stuff of fantasy, the idea that somehow companies are going to be held responsible and are going to fork out the money for that responsibility. Flash forward round about 10 years, and actually EPR schemes are now being introduced. Several American states have their own EPR legislation, and actually Europe is also requiring state level or country level EPR legislation. I believe the European legislation kicks in by 2026, and most countries are required to have their own variations of this ahead of that point, which means that actually this is becoming law. And so I think it's interesting now to go into how is this sort of structured. So the typical way that an EPR scheme is structured is where the legislator, the government, parliament, whatever, brings in the law requiring an EPR scheme to exist. You then need people to pay money. So the business, let's say the business may be the brand, it may be whoever is held responsible for the waste that's being generated. That business is the party that's going to be paying money. They need to pay money to someone. And so the intermediary is called a PRO. It stands for a Producer Responsibility Organization. Really catchy name there. And so this PRO is responsible for receiving the funds from the corporate that is paying the funds out. And the PRO is then responsible for making sure that those funds go towards waste collection and recycling and the proper disposal and the proper end of life of this stuff. And so you basically have 3 or 4 parties here. There's the legislator, there's the company, there's the PRO, the intermediary. There is the entity that the PRO pays, which might be a municipality, it might be a waste management company. If it's a municipality, then there's another entity, which is the waste management company that the municipality contracts. You can already sort of see what I'm going to be hinting at, which is there's a lot of different actors in this chain. There's a bunch of data that also has to get put together. Now, what's interesting is that the dollar amounts that have to be paid are not huge in the scheme of things. I mean, most countries estimate that we're, talking about, let's say, the low hundreds of millions of dollars for a G7 economy in terms of additional costs proposed for various corporations. But the reporting requirements, the data gathering requirements can be pretty onerous in their own right. Now, if you're in the US, you're going to have to comply, let's say, with several different states, all of which have their own legislation, all of which might have their own PROs distributing funds, all of which might be distributing funds to different municipalities. That's just several states in the US. Imagine now you throw in Europe, you're a big global company, you might have 20, 30, 40 of these different schemes that you're complying against before long, and they might all be very, very different. That is problem number 1. We're going to be listing problems. I'm probably going to lose track of the numbers, but let's call that problem number 1. You then move into another space, which is, let's say it's like the who watches the watchers, or basically who are these PROs anyway. And so I actually did a bunch of research, and I was intrigued to find that most PROs were organizations I'd never heard of. Like in the UK, for example, there seem to be several reasonably well-established PROs. I had never heard of them. They are all owned by different companies. Many of those companies appear to be waste management organizations. So it's actually quite interesting where if you think about waste management organizations' incentives, they are generally incentivized by volume of waste. They mostly get paid by municipalities based on the amount of waste that they are collecting, recycling, processing. But they also appear to be owning, backing, partnering, involved with PROs that are officially, ostensibly responsible for reducing the amount of packaging waste that is being generated by producers. So I thought that was interesting. Let's call that problem number 2. The other interesting thing is that it doesn't seem like there is a huge amount of uniform scrutiny across PROs. Now, I don't mean to do any PROs any discredit, but it seems to me that there have been some fairly public instances of PROs sort of collapsing in scandal. One that I found quite interesting is an organization called Redisa. So Redisa was the Recycling and Economic Development Initiative of South Africa. It was launched, I believe, in 2012. I actually found that super interesting because I, at some point, met the CEO of Redisa, again, around 2014, 2015. And I thought it was a really exciting organization because what they were doing was that they were focusing on tires. So they said, we want to focus our EPR efforts on a waste category that is really uniform and consistent. It is just tires. We don't care about anything else. We just care about rubber tires. It's sort of fungible. It's also reasonably high value waste. Like a tire is on the pecking order of waste categories. It's actually not It's not a very low value waste thing. It's a reasonable value waste item. It's also quite easily reusable. You can get more use out of used tires, and you can actually bring the tires back to the producer as well, because the producer labels the tire. You'll have like Michelin or Goodyear or whatever on the tire. And so the ambition for Redisa was we're actually going to bring these tires back to the same producer. And as a result, the producer is going to produce better and better and more durable tires, because they're going to know that they're going to get the tires back. They're going to be the ones that get those same tires back. And therefore, what they're financing is actually not just about end-of-life disposal. It's also about recycled content on their side and actually lowering their cost of goods as well. So I thought that was super interesting. I found out some time ago that actually Redisa had collapsed due to financial mismanagement allegations, various, I don't want to call it fraud, but various fraudulent-esque behavior patterns and so on. And so that made me a little alarmed just at the level of scrutiny that may be required for these PROs versus what exists in the market. It's an area which I think is a little fuzzy. And I say that because it sits at this weird cross-section between some PROs being non-profits, some being corporates. And I think that always ends up being, let's say, a delicate area to scrutinize. So I think problem number 3 is who's actually scrutinizing PROs for performance and making sure that PROs are above bar and that these funds are being used in the right way. Now, let's move on towards what EPR schemes are trying to accomplish. EPR schemes are basically focused on a couple of things. One is that they are focused on covering the costs of the waste collection and treatment. And the second is reducing the generation of waste. And so EPR schemes usually have 2 components. One is to sort of incentivize you to produce less waste, and the other is to require you to pay for the treatment and disposal of the waste that you're producing. Here's where we get towards the hot takes. So I think that there are going to be a few things that are going to play out in this market. One, this podcast is brought to you by Altruistiq. Sustainability teams have one thing in common. They all have messy data sitting in silos across the business. This means 60% or more of their time is spent getting data into shape and not making sense of that data or using it to drive action. Altruistiq's AI-based tools can help. Meet Evie, your in-house, always-on-call sustainability assistant. Evie works alongside you and your teams to clean up and transform your enterprise data into usable emissions calculations. Even better, Evie helps you interrogate this data, working like the junior analyst you wish you had. AI alone won't solve all your problems, but data transformation is one you can cross off your list. Visit altruistiq.com to find out more. That's Altruistiq with a Q. I think that EPR schemes are going to accelerate significantly. I actually think that there's going to be, over the next several years, I think we're going to see a steady uptick in the number of EPR schemes that come out. I think that the schemes in the US are going to go from several schemes to a few dozen schemes. And I think that in Europe, you're obviously going to get a rollout based on European legislation. And I think that rapidly you're going to see other geographies and other systems also introduce their own. I think that the impulse for this is twofold. One is a little fuzzy and one is pretty hard. The fuzzy one, or the fluffy one, is I think that consumers are starting to care more about waste. Just side anecdote, I have a new puppy. I got a puppy a few months ago. And every time I take my puppy for a walk, I have to keep a really close eye out to make sure that she doesn't eat some crap off the road. Could be a tissue, could be a wrapper, could be like a surgical glove the other day. I think that most consumers, even those who don't have puppies, God bless them, are struggling with just the sheer way in which waste is treated. And I think waste has become a very sensitive, very emotive issue. This, I would say, is the fluffy reason. The harder reason, which I think is actually a little more interesting, is that most municipalities seem to be short of money, seem to be chronically short of money. From my observation of financial markets, it seems that municipalities are always the ones releasing the highest yield bonds, borrowing money at the highest cost, struggling to make ends meet. This is true in the UK. This seems to be true in the US and most other markets that I've been exposed to, which means that they need to find ways to cover their costs. the big costs of municipalities tend to be waste management, actually. There's a few other categories, but waste management is usually a big one. So I think it is in the interest of most municipalities to find a way to effectively impose a tax on corporations to say, we're not going to pay for the cost of waste collection and treatment anymore. We want you to pay this. We want you to subsidize it. So I think that this is going to be one of the drivers for EPR schemes to be on the rise. I think that what's interesting is that EPR schemes also seem to be sidestepping the whole sustainability ESG backlash that we've all been watching play out for the last few years. EPR schemes tend to be simply about municipal services. It seems to be treated as just a very different thing, just a very different bucket of issue. Which is why I think you're less likely to get this visceral objection or visceral opposition from different ends of the political spectrum. So I think that EPR schemes are going to have a reasonably straightforward, reasonably smooth road towards accelerating their rollout. The other thing that I think is going to happen is I think that we're going to start to see some form of market consolidation emerge to solve the problem that right now it is going to be a real pain for large companies to meet their compliance requirements. There are just so many schemes. It is just too much work. And if you look at, let's say, climate-related disclosures and information, that's already quite a lot of work. And usually we're just talking about California and CSRD in those cases, and maybe a couple of other pieces. But imagine, we're dozens of different schemes where it's not just about disclosures and form completion. It's also about like payments and fees and, potentially also requirements to pitch up and collaborate and do different things with different schemes and different PROs. I think this is going to be a nightmare. So I think that creates a really fertile ground of opportunity for consolidators of different shades to come up and say, we will take this burden away from you, dear corporate, and we will cover it across all of the different geographies where you have exposure. What I can already see from my own research is that most of the sustainability consultancies around the world already are setting up programs to support their clients through EPR. And I think of consultancies as the fruit flies of the corporate ecosystem, where there is fruit, they will come. And therefore, I think you can already tell that this is fertile territory of opportunity. I think that whether that consolidator ends up being a service provider like a consultancy or a software provider or a waste management company or some other shade, or even just, let's say, a macro PRO, one PRO to rule all the PROs, is a little unclear to me. But I think that there's a clear consolidation opportunity here for some sort of institution. I think that there's going to start to be some scrutiny of the conflict of interest that I mentioned earlier. I think that was problem number 2, but I've lost track like I promised. And I think that that's not a straightforward and not an easy problem, and I think it's probably not an important problem. But I think at some point there's going to be some recognition that there is a potential conflict of interest here. The way that I expect this to run is I expect some form of scandal. I expect some form of expose by some newspaper or broadsheet or the other. And I think that'll start to trigger more scrutiny, and I think that'll start to trigger some reform. So I think that'll take time, but I think some separation of who are these PROs anyway, and should they be waste companies, should they be nonprofits, or should they be some independent corporate, I think that'll start to come a little more to the fore. So watch this space. And then I think that the area that is most exciting for me from a additionality perspective, I think there's 2 areas that are quite interesting from additionality. And by additionality, I just mean like, are they net adding something to the world beyond everyone moving paper around? I mean, I don't get me wrong. I'm super happy for municipalities to get a couple more $100 million in every big country where they operate. But I think what's really interesting and exciting for me is how do we actually change the system such that the system works better? And I think there are 2 ways in which this happens. One is that I think if you can get that Redisa model that I talked about, which is, can I actually, as a producer, as a brand, as a corporate, can I not just pay you, the PRO, to take care of the problem for me, but can I also somehow get the material back? I think that gets to be interesting. If I am, let's say, if I'm P&G, I'm making Head & Shoulders of shampoo. I hope Head & Shoulders is a P&G brand. I think it is. Then can I actually get those bottles back? I don't just want to go and buy my recycled PET and HDPE and other plastics on the open market independently myself. I want to actually get this particular thing back, this particular thing that I made and that has my branding on it. I want to get it back. And the reason that I want to get it back is not because I'm sentimental, but because if I get it back, I can start manufacturing with that in mind. I can actually manufacture it in such a way that it is more useful to me once I get the waste thing back. The company that does this really, really well is Tetra Pak. Tetra Pak may be, in fact, the best example I've seen, and I've seen a lot. Tetra Pak, I think, is probably the best example of this, where if you look at a Tetra Pak, say if you've bought like any kind of juices or anything like that, you've probably bought a Tetra Pak recently. Tetra Pak is really, really good at taking an old Tetra Pak and converting it into a new Tetra Pak. And they've designed it with that in mind, that it is an easy waste product, an easy packaging product for Tetra Pak to turn into a new packaging product. The downside is you have to get it back to Tetra Pak. It can't be done by anyone else. It has to get back to Tetra Pak, and then they can do their magic and make it a new Tetra Pak. And I think that if more producers were able to do that, that would be really interesting, really exciting. And one of the big bottlenecks, maybe the big bottleneck to that, is, well, how the hell do you actually get this back to you, right? Once you've thrown it out into the ecosystem and sold it at a Tesco near you, how do you get it back to wherever it was that you made this? So I think that if PROs can start to solve that problem, they can actually tap into not simply the sort of fruit fly activity of charging fees and requiring data and then going about their business, but actually get into the space of, well, can I also provide you with recyclable content? Can I also provide you with stuff that you can use to make new stuff? And I think that's a much bigger value add, which I'm really interested to watch play out. The other piece of incrementality that I think about, and I promised you too, is we're also seeing a lot of regulation around single-use packaging, particularly single-use plastic packaging. And I think that this and EPR can go quite nicely together, in both reinforcing the same behavior, which might be a movement towards more durable packaging formats, which is if I have to use less single-use packaging anyway, and I have a potential to get back my packaging material to my business, can I actually just start moving towards things that are more durable, things that can last better, and just things that don't require as much material loss in the recycling process? Because for anyone who's been exposed to recycling processes, even in the best of circumstances, you tend to lose material in the recycling process, which means if I get something back, it's very rare that 100% of that packaging material that I get back can be converted into a new package without the need for additional material to be included. If I get back, let's say, a piece of cardboard packaging from an Amazon package or something like that, it's likely that in the recycling process, I'll lose 30 or 40% of that mass, which means if I want to create a new Amazon package, I need to add back 30 to 40% new content to create a new package. My numbers, I think, are broadly right there. And so actually, like if you were to produce things where you know you're going to get it back, you can make them more durable, which means that you just are able to lose less and add back less, and therefore just less incremental packaging content needs to go into the system. I think that's going to be a really interesting space that I hope plays out. To bring this full circle back to my chat with Michael, what I think is going to be really interesting is what sort of opportunities does this theme create? And that was where like Michael and I kind of started that conversation, which is, what do we think are opportunities in this space that will drive value and impact all at the same time? And I think it's not simply EPR compliance. I think it's this circularity of the actual material. And I'm keen to see how this plays out over the next couple of years as legislation starts to tick in. And I'm keen to see how the different stakeholders in this system rise to the challenge of not just getting it done, but actually making it better. Thanks for listening. Next up, we're going to have Leo Wang, the founder and CEO of Buffy. Those in North America will know Buffy. It's one of the leading direct-to-consumer comforter brands or bedding brands. I usually go around saying the leading, but Leo usually corrects me. And we're going to have Leo with us to talk about sustainable brand building, which is a topic that I find incredibly exciting, and I'm sure you will too. Follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll be notified as soon as the episode drops.